If you're under 40 or haven't been working in agriculture for the last 20 years, you may not know about a really important corn pest in the Corn Belt called European corn borer. We just wrapped up a field day here at Field talking about corn borer, and I just wanted to recap some of the highlights on how to identify and scout this really important pest. My name is Erin Hodson, and I'm an extension entomologist with Iowa State University, so let's get started. The whole reason that I decided to create this event all about European corn borer is because I'm learning from some entomologists in Canada and Eastern US about some issues that are going on with unexpected injury. So in the past, when people have been planting BT since 1996, they are getting excellent performance. Very, very few infested plants. Injury is almost non-detectable. And actually the amount of overall European corn borers in the landscape has drastically been reduced and benefited even people that weren't using BT. But since 2018 and 19, there have been some commercial fields in Nova Scotia where they are noticing unexpected injury. So they're going into cornfields and they're noticing tunneling within the stalk, and then just where the ear attaches to the stalk, a really weakened ear, sometimes even falling off the plant. It's really concerning because it's unlike the performance that we've seen in the vast majority of North America. And then just last year in Connecticut, there was an entomologist that saw the same pattern. So people were using BT, expecting good performance, but then noticing a lot of weakened stalks. And so they were sampling in the ears and in the stalks and saw lots of tunneling, lots of frass, and the caterpillars were easy to find. So this research is ongoing to define whether this is resistance or other issues happening with the performance of BT. I don't suspect any performance issues with European corn borer and BT in Iowa, but my goal for this field day was just to help raise awareness about what the moth and the larvae look like, how to recognize injury in the vegetative state and also in reproductive corn. And then once we have those search images in our mind about how to distinguish corn borers from maybe pathogens that might be weakening the stalk and some other issues, what we can do about it. So again, I'm not suggesting anything is happening with poor performance of BT corn, but there is plenty of non-BT corn in Iowa, sweet corn, popcorn, and some corn that's grown for human consumption or white corn. We want to make sure that those areas would be considered high risk and deserve a lot of our attention for scouting. We are going to take a quick pause from that nice warm field day back in July, and I'm in the studio now to share a little bit more information about the biology, life cycle, and ecology of corn borers before we move back in the field. I wanted to share a summary from a 2020 needs assessment that I helped out with, where we asked farmers, what is your biggest corn pest of concern? And you can see the map here. I wasn't too surprised that most of the counties, especially in northern counties, responded with western or northern corn rootworm. I was somewhat surprised by those who responded in green that said corn earworm was their pest of biggest concern. But I was very surprised to see all those counties, about 20%, responded that European corn borer was still a concern. And so this may be an artifact of where people are growing non-BT corn or just farmers that happen to be farming before 1996 and still have that memory of the devastation that corn borers can cause. But I thought this needs assessment was really something that sparked my interest to learn more about what people are experiencing in the field. So I wanted to review the life cycle of corn borers because it is really important when we think about management. They have a typical life cycle like all butterflies and moths when they go through complete metamorphosis. So that's 4 distinct life stages: egg, larva, pupa, and adult. When the eggs hatch into first instars, they're a light colored with a dark head capsule. I don't think you would mistake corn borer larvae from other kinds of caterpillars that you're going to find in the field. They will move through 5 instars, gradually getting a little bit bigger, eating a little bit more, and causing more injury before they move into a resting pupal stage. Now, the time that it takes to get from egg to an adult is about 5 weeks. That's a generation time. And when we think about how many generations are possible in North America, it ranges from 1 to 4. In some of the Canadian provinces and northern Minnesota, northern Wisconsin, and North Dakota, you can have one generation per year. But as you move further south, like Iowa, it's a strong 2 generation per year life cycle. And it can get up to 4 generations as you move into southern United States. So, in addition to having multiple generations per year, there are also two pheromone based races in North America. The vast majority race, or the largest proportion, is the Z race. It is a strong preference for feeding on corn, it's how they do their best. There's also a second race called the E race that is largely restricted to eastern states and provinces. It does have a wider host range, likely because of the more diverse cropping system on the East Coast. It's important to know that the Z race and the E race can overlap in range, and hybridization between the two races is possible. But for the vast majority of the north central region, and particularly Iowa, we would have the Z race. So it's important because if you're getting pheromones to try and trap the adults, make sure that the pheromones say Z race or Iowa race on the package. As I said, I think identifying little brown moths is very hard, especially in the field. And so, my recommendation to newbies is to look at the relative size. So, when you're looking at lots of moths, you'll kind of gauge what is a medium size and a small size moth. Also, if your eyesight is good enough, you'll be able to look at the size and the shape of the head, legs, antennae, and body. We have a guide to moth identification for commonly known moths in corn available that you can see in the resources with this Crops TV episode. But really, the most important thing that you want to be looking at is the scale, the size, and the shape. And the patterns on the forewings. So, those scales that we see as lines, spots, bumps are something that can be really key identifiers. And we want to be looking at how the moths lay their wings at rest. So these two pictures that I have on the right side are fall armyworm. They're both fall armyworm, even though they looked pretty different. The top moth has been prepared where the wings are spread out in order to keep them for a collection. The bottom one is a more natural position in which the wings are held roof-like over the back, and you can see quite a bit of color and texture with the scales that are on those forewings. I also think it's important to note beyond the physical characters, the time of day and the time of year that you see the moths and where they're at, because they certainly could be in corn, but they utilize a lot of other plants in the landscape to rest, find mates, and seek out refuge. So the top moth here again is a European corn borer. I think of all the economically important moths in corn, this one is going to be the small side with a 1 inch wingspan. They're also very light in color. The forewings are a light brown or tan with some dark and light alternating wavy lines. And you can kind of see that the wing tips or edges are kind of fringed. I think they have a fairly slender body, and most of the abdomen is relatively hairless compared to some of the other moths that you'll see, like black cutworm. It is a medium sized moth with a wingspan of up to 2 inches. The forewings are much darker and they have this characteristic black dagger on the forewings. The hindwings are pretty light, and you notice that the body is more stout, and their thorax and abdomen are fairly hairy compared to corn borers. And then also common to see are corn earworms. They're a little bit smaller than black cutworms, a medium-sized moth. They're usually light colored, but it kind of looks like peppered or mottled with lots of little spots, but they do have a dark spot shown with that arrow on each forewing. And then also similar size and shape would be true armyworms, a medium-sized moth. They're very light in color, almost white with little brown specks, and they have a characteristic white spot on the forewing. Again, it's hard to see because usually you don't see them with their wings spread out, and they're usually very skittish if you approach them in the field. So this takes some time, but if you happen to be using traps, you'll notice a variety of little brown moths showing up in those traps. So, our next sections, we are going to move out into the field to learn more about trap types and why it's really important to trap for making management decisions. And then we'll kind of hop back and forth looking at plant injury and the yield loss potential of corn borers back in the studio, and then finish up this episode in the field looking at first generation and second generation scouting. So, let's go. In the case of European corn borers, the females are a little bit larger and they're a little bit lighter, kind of a buff brown color. Notice her wings are held flat over her back and you can't see the tip of her abdomen. It is pretty rounded and swollen right now, full of eggs. The males are darker, they're smaller, and usually the tip of their abdomen is hanging out the back of their wings. So there is a male European corn borer. Again, it's smaller. It's a darker brown with more dark wavy lines on the wings. The wings are held flat over the back, but in this case, the males, you can see the very tip of the abdomen poking out the back side, and it's usually kind of pointy. Okay, we're back in the studio, and we learned more about how trap type is really essential for European corn borer, especially compared to other moths that we see in corn. And the pheromone that we select is also very important. Remember, we need the Z race or the Iowa race or Iowa strain to be most effective. And ultimately, at the end of the day, what you're trying to do is collect the very first adult in the landscape known as the biofix. That sets the tone for the rest of the season. Once we establish the biofix, shown in this figure here with the blue circle, we can predictably estimate the development of not only first generation, but the second generation life stages. Most of the time when we're recommending scouting, you're looking for first and second instars. It's a fairly quick turnaround after finding the biofix in your traps. But those scouting prompts will help hone in when you start to scout and ultimately if you need to treat. So it's a very predictable accumulation based on degree days or heat units. And so we would be looking to capture that biofix because every year would be a little bit different and you just want to be as accurate as possible. When you do decide to scout, I recommend scouting or looking at 20 plants at 5 locations for every 50 acres of a field. So, depending on the size and shape, more samples is always more better. But you want to try and get a representative sample from the fields that you're sampling and ultimately making treatment decisions. If you don't have a weather station at your farm or if your clients don't, I wanted you to be aware of a weather station application through the Mesonet at the agronomy department at Iowa State. Ashley Dean and I have created this module just for European corn borers to track growing degree days with our weather station network around the state of Iowa. So you'd be able to go and click based on your biofix if you wanted to be more specific, but we have a general forecasting tool available with a map that looks like this. So you can scan this QR code or type in this URL to get to this European corn borer module. And just to let you know, we have a few other forecasting tools for other pests like Japanese beetle in case you're interested in tracking and honing in or making your scouting efforts the most efficient that you can. We are talking about European corn borers in this episode because they are probably the most devastating pest that we have in corn. They are creating fantastic levels of injury per individual, more than any other pest that I can think of. And it's really the larvae that we care about for feeding and injuring the plant. And it's actually the first generation larvae that cause the most economic loss. So if they are feeding during V6 through V10, one larva can cause a 5 to 6% yield loss per plant. it is an exceptional amount of injury that an individual can do because they're interfering with all those tissues that are eventually going to produce an ear. The second generation for corn borers are also fairly substantial, in which an individual could cause a 2 to 3% yield loss during that R2 to R4 time. It's because of where they're feeding. It could be feeding on kernels, inside of the cob, the shank, and then eventually down into the corn stalk. And because when and where they're feeding, you could have an ear that doesn't produce normally. It could be weakened at that point of attachment from the stalk to the ear, in which the ear can droop or even fall off the plant, which would be completely devastating if you had a lot of those ears in that field where the ears are on the ground and you're not able to pick those up. The feeding sites from the larvae also create entries for pathogens, and you could have, depending on the year, very substantial reduced grain quality because you have toxins, fungal pathogens, and molds and other things infecting the ears and causing contamination issues down the line. Now, the management of corn borer is fairly complicated, and really we only need to think about management or rescue treatments in non-BT corn in Iowa right now. I'll let you know if that changes. But those people that don't have BT really need to think about early and frequent scouting. Remember, every year is a little bit different, but we want to be capturing that biofix. The treatment thresholds are different for first and second instars, but are based on things like how many corn borers are out there. Usually it's based on egg masses or caterpillars. The yield loss potential, which I just described, is fairly high. You have to be able to estimate actual control costs. So that's chemical, fuel, equipment, people power, and try and predict the estimated market value. So all these metrics go into creating a treatment threshold so that it would be slightly individual or dynamic based on your control costs and market value. So this is something that's a very quick turnaround. So if you're scouting and you reach that threshold, you have a few days in order to make a rescue treatment, which can become difficult if you have to try and contract a full year application, especially during the second generation when corn is tall. Sometimes it limits your rescue treatment options. And even if you get it all right, the first generation or the second generation, and you're treating in a very timely manner, the best that we can hope for corn borer is an 80% suppression. And I would consider this number, frankly, unacceptable for a lot of the other insects that we think about using rescue treatments. But for corn borer, because of where they are, they're feeding on the undersides of the leaves and very quickly try and get to the inside of the plant. They are no longer susceptible to those contact insecticides that we're using in corn. And so there are going to be survivors. You just hope that the number of survivors is under an acceptable level, under that economic threshold or economic injury level. So, because of what we know about the loss potential from individuals in the first generation or the second generation, when BT corn became commercially available in 1996, you could imagine in Iowa and other regions of the US, the percent adoption was very high. Just a few years later, rootworm traits came out in 2003. And in the United States, we had sort of this exponential adoption of transgenic herbicide and BT options for corn acres in the US. And that remained very high, sometimes reaching up to 95% adoption. It has backed off a little bit, and the USDA does a survey every year. And in 2024, 86% of corn plants in the US had some sort of BT option. And it's a little bit less in Iowa. 81% in Iowa had at least one form of BT in their genetics. So with that, we're going to move back into the field and to learn more about recognizing injury in first generation and second generation corn borers. One of the first things that we want to talk about, it's really important, is adult identification, because European corn borer is a little brown moth, and there's lots of little brown moths in the world, especially around Iowa. So we use these really sensitive traps to collect the adults in order to start when we're sampling in the field. So unlike other pests where we just start monitoring, say, January 1st or March 1st, we use pheromone-baited traps to attract males into these traps so that we know when they're moving around the landscape, because every spring is going to be a little bit different. There are a couple different trap types out there, and for European corn borer, the trap type really matters. The most sensitive trap that we have for detecting male European corn borers is called a heart stack trap. It is heavy, it's cumbersome, it's hard to store, and it's very expensive, but it is the most sensitive. And there's only a few places that you can buy, so it's not something that probably the everyday person is going to use. The Heliothrus trap is a distant second as far as sensitivity for trap type, but it's more accessible, it's cheaper, you can store it a little bit easier, and you'd be able to use it year after year after year. So it's very similar in that you would bait it with a lure that attracts males. And other traps are out there which are great for black cutworm, true armyworm, and some other moths, but the heart stack and the Heliothrus are strongly preferred. And the whole goal of trapping is to catch the very first one. Experts would say if you have an average size farm around Iowa, you only need about 3 traps for your entire farm. So it's not like you have to put a lot of traps out there. You'd want to put the traps out, say, the 2nd or 3rd week of May, and check them every day until you find the very first moth, and that's called the biofix. And what happens when you hit that biofix is you start tracking accumulating heat units or degree days, which are exactly the same method for estimating heat units in developing corn. And from that biofix, you can track the development of eggs, larvae, pupae, and the next generation of adults within that farm. So it's a really important method for timing when you're going to be out in the field. And we'll talk about that timing in a little bit more detail. But the traps are an essential part, especially if you are growing sweet corn or any other type of corn that doesn't have any BT. And so that's going to happen every year. Once you hit the biofix, you can remove the traps and then initiate your sampling program in the corn. Trap placement, trap type is really important for corn borers. And so I'm going to leave it up to Dr. Tom Sappington to talk about the number of traps, where to put the traps, how high to put the traps, and he'll give you a little bit more information to even further help your sampling efforts.
Okay, so one of the things we're going to talk about, or the main topic for this station, is to talk about sampling adults. And we sample adults not because they can tell us when we've hit threshold. They cannot do that, despite decades of people thinking I'll be different and I'll try it, and then, with research, it doesn't work, and there's reasons for that. But they do tell you when the first emergence is starting to happen. That tells you when to start scouting for things like egg masses, if it's second generation on the leaves, or sampling shot hole damage in whirl stage corn. And that saves you a lot of grief sampling before you need it or after it's too late. So it's important to get good data. It's important to have traps that are sensitive, that can pick up early moths when the populations are low. So you can use a blacklight trap. Most people don't because they're hard to maintain. They got to have a power supply, and you catch everything that stumbles into them at night. Usually you would use a pheromone trap. So we've got 3 different kinds of pheromone traps displayed here. This is called a heart stack trap or a cone trap. The idea is that you put the pheromone lure down here. It's a rubber septum. It's impregnated with a synthetic pheromone that's available commercially that is released by the pheromone to attract males from a distance, so the males can find the females. There is no male pheromone. I mean, there's one on their wings, but it's short range. You can't use it to attract anything. So you'll only catch males in these traps. But that's okay for telling you when first emergence is and starting the degree day model. So the moths get in this opening in the bottom and they work their way up, because anything that feels trapped goes up when you're an insect, and they end up in the top. So the next one down is like this in design, but it's made out of nylon, and that's usually called a heliothis trap. You'll see it advertised like that commercially. And it's the same principle, but it's a lot cheaper and it's easier to get. These are real expensive, and it's really hard to find somebody who sells them. The one down on the end is called a wing trap or a sticky trap. It's got goo on the bottom, and you put the pheromone in there, and moths that flutter around, the pheromone get trapped in the sticky part of the trap. Those do not work at all, practically not at all, for European corn borers, so don't use them. They're super cheap, really convenient, but they won't give you any information, good or bad. They just won't catch corn borers. There's another kind called a bucket trap that's plastic, and it's kind of cylinder shaped, and it's got a funnel at the top and a little rain guard on top where the pheromone hangs below it. And the moths flutter around that and they fall down into the bucket trap. That doesn't work for corn borers either. They're also cheap and convenient, but they don't work for corn borers. They work for other species as well as the wing trap does too, but just for some reason they don't catch corn borers. So don't use them. The pheromone is real specific for European corn borers. There's two pheromone races of corn borer. There's the E strain and the Z strain. So around here we've only got the Z strain. So don't buy the E strain by accident, and it won't be labeled like that. They call it Iowa lure or New York lure, I think, in some of these places that sell them. You want the Iowa lure, whether you live in Iowa or not. So anything in the main corn belt, Ohio to the west, is going to be a Z. So you want to get the Iowa strain lure. When you set these out, the adults will congregate in the grass to mate at night. They're there, that's where they are during the day. There's always a few in the cornfield, but most of them don't stay there. The females go in to lay eggs and they come back. So the traps should be in the grass, usually a ditch, or it could be a waterway or a fence row, somewhere where there's tall, lush grass. This is kind of what you would see, but wider is what they're looking for mating. And you want to put the traps next to corn, but not in the corn. And you want them down in the grass. So you wouldn't set it up like this. This is just a demo to show you the kind of trap. But you want, for corn borers, you want to, if the grass is this tall, you want that opening to be that far below the top of the grass canopy. And it goes against our instincts to do that, because you think it would be better to have it clean so they would have unobstructed access to get caught, but they won't go there to start with. So for whatever reason, and they're down in the grass moving around, males look, following the pheromone plume of a female, will find it better and be more attracted to it if it's down in the grass. Most other insects, that's not true. Cutworms and armyworms, you do want it clean around, but corn borers are different. What else can I tell you? So this pheromone, don't get tempted into putting two different kinds of lures in there. You can tell a cutworm real easy from a corn borer, so why waste your money on two traps? You can put them both in the thing. Don't do it, because they antagonize each other. The moths can sense it, and they'll avoid the trap. So it's like a repellent for both species. And you don't want to do that. And by the same token, you want the traps, if you're trapping for different species, you want them about 50 feet apart from each other so that they don't interfere with each other. So it's not convenient, but you can be convenient and not get any data, or not get the information you need. So you use this. You can't use it to tell you about thresholds, because the thing is that they're good at detecting moths when there's a low population, but when the population itself starts to rise, it's competing with the wild females, this pheromone, because the wild females are releasing pheromones. And as the population rises, the captures in the trap goes down. So you can't use it for that. But it does tell you when to start looking at degree days and when to start scouting in the field. So.
So one of the key points about scouting for first generation corn borer larvae, it's a very short window of time to do this scouting. So once you've reached your biofix, you can estimate how much time before you can start scouting. And really what you want to do for high-risk fields would be the earliest planted cornfields or the tallest cornfields on the farm. Those are the ones where the females find especially attractive for laying their eggs. So what I like to do when sampling to see if we have corn borers or not is just pulling the plant right above that last leaf axil, just pulling it out of the plant and then looking for signs of injury. The young larvae are going to create window painting and shot holes, those repeating patterns in the leaf as the leaves are unfurling from the whorl. The larger larvae can burrow into the midrib, and eventually they're going to make their way inside of the stalk. And they create a lot of frass when doing this. And so oftentimes an infested plant is going to look like it's kind of covered in a dry sawdust. And that's also another visual cue that you might have corn borers in that plant. And so after I pull this plant, I can often just start to basically unwind. And you're just pulling back the layers and looking for evidence. Again, there's going to be some defoliation. There's going to be some frass. And if they're big enough, they are going to be starting to tunnel inside. So it's kind of fun. We had one participant that really got into this mid-rib tunneling, and there's the corn borer there. These plots were infested about 3 weeks ago, and so that caterpillar is about halfway grown. It's going to be feeding for another couple weeks and just consuming, again, getting inside of the stalk and consuming the tissue and weakening the stalk. Okay, so one really visible sign that you have European corn borer is this repeating shot hole pattern. So when this leaf was wrapped up in the whorl, you had first and second instar larvae taking small bites. And because it was wrapped up, it kind of looks like when you make those snowflakes or paper dolls. So it's a repeating pattern. So this has been feeding for a while, and you're going to notice as they feed, they release a lot of this very dry sawdust frass. And so that's also another indication that you had feeding for quite a while. This one has actually started to tunnel into the midrib, which is an indication that you have a little bit larger, maybe a third or fourth instar. So one of the first clues of European corn borer feeding is a classic window pane type of injury where the larvae, once they hatch from those egg masses, are going to attempt to feed, but they're very small. So first and second instars basically scrape away the bottom layer of the mesophyll, and it creates a window pane effect. And if you were to hold it up to the light, there's still tissue there, but you can see right through it. So this is a great diagnostic feature that you would be able to distinguish, say, from pathogens that might be on the leaves, is that window painting effect. A couple questions that we had at the field day were trying to distinguish European corn borer feeding from stink bug injury. And I also have trouble with this, and so some things that I learned is that with corn borers, you're going to get some really nice kind of crisp lines, and often in a repeating fashion. Stink bugs usually infest plants at a little bit earlier vegetative stage, and their saliva creates a little bit of injury around each circle. And the circles are more oblong or irregular shaped, so they're not these nice repeating circles, but they're kind of more oblong ovals with a yellowish ring around them. We had some questions at the field day for people that were trying to distinguish the larval feeding from corn borers from the adult feeding from corn rootworm. This can happen if corn rootworms emerge from the soil before silks are available to feed on. I think the injury is also a window pane type of effect, but the area that is consumed is much larger. They're a lot larger insect as an adult corn rootworm versus young European corn borer larva. So you'd be able to hold it up and see through it, but the extent of feeding is a little bit bigger, and the actual scraping is a little bit wider than it would be for a corn borer. So unlike the first generation of European corn borer females that prefer early planted or the tallest plants in the landscape, second generation females actually prefer delayed planting, late maturing varieties. Anything that's a little less mature in the landscape is where they prefer to lay their eggs. We can help you focus your scouting efforts by looking for egg masses on the ear leaf, 3 above, and 3 below. That's the vast majority of where the females are going to be laying eggs, so you just focus your efforts on those 7 leaves as you move through a field. Female European corn borers like to lay their eggs on the undersides of leaves, very close to the midrib usually. And so if you turn this leaf over, you're going to notice an egg mass right here. She lays her eggs that look like fish scales, so they're overlapping, and they're bright white when they're first laid, usually around 15 to 20 per mass. And she's going to do that over a period of about 10 to 14 days. As these egg masses mature, they're going to darken up, and you're going to actually be able to see the head of the larvae that's developing. So these egg masses will turn dark just before they hatch. So as the field season approaches in 2025 and beyond, I just ask for you to keep this pest in mind as a potential. As if you're walking through corn, you're scouting corn, you're seeing different things that are going on, and you may see something that looks a little bit different. You see a weakened or squishy stalk, you might see frass in or around the ear, or maybe even sometimes to the extent where the ear gets quite injured and maybe droops or falls off the plant. It can be easily mistaken for lots of other things, and so hopefully with this video you're able to distinguish European corn borer injury from other things. And then if you were ever to see anything where you were planting in a BT field, you're noticing some injury, please reach out to us. We would love to take a visit and just see if there's anything happening here in our state. We got a lot of help for the field day today, and I'd like to give some acknowledgments to the people that have been working in European corn borer for a lifetime, especially Dr. Tom Sappington, Dr. Craig Abel, Dr. Brad Coates. Keith Bidney is a scientist at the USDA that does all the colony rearing and allowed us to have a really excellent field day and gave us lots to look at with infested plants. So I'd like to thank all of those USDA collaborators. And we also had Dr. Marlon Rice, who is an emeritus faculty with Iowa State, who gave us a primer on identification, life cycle, and biology. So I want to say thanks to all those guys for helping out today. Thank you for watching the video today about European corn borer. Maybe it's a new pest to you, or maybe it's a blast from the past and a refresher. I have a couple of resources online and available through the extension store to help with the treatment threshold calculators for first generation and second generation activity. And so that's a really helpful resource, but also just stay in touch with myself through social media, email. It's not hard to find me, and I'd really appreciate anything that you might see out there. Thanks for watching.